Hello, BookTube. You could tell from the background that the bean and I have moved, and I'm able to do that. I'm able to show you surround sound because of my wonderful tripod. The best $6 I ever spent. So I want to make a couple of videos. I don't want to neglect you while I'm up in the little farmhouse in Vermont. And the first one I want to make, the reason I'm looking away is I'm looking at my laptop. And if Greg at Supposedly Fun can do that and you all think it's cool and sexy, then I can do it. Okay? And the reason I'm looking at my laptop is because there's a tag going around. It is starting to gain speed, and it's a tag about yours truly. It was made by the Mayberry Bookclub. I'll leave a link to his channel down below, and it is a tag in which you put forward 8 books you think Steve has not read. And apparently I've made a lot of enemies on BookTube because now everybody wants to do this. So Brian at Bookish made his own version of this tag, and he listed some books, and I could have put a comment on his video saying, which ones I've read and which ones I've hadn't and what my ratio are and whatnot. But I thought I'd talk about them a bit instead. Especially since Brian starts off with a book that demonstrates what I think we all know about him, which is that he is Satan. He starts off, okay, pronunciation varies all over the Emerald Isle. I first heard the pronunciation as the Tain. I believe the most widespread pronunciation is the Tain. You can ask Jason at Old Blues Chapter. No, not Old Blues Chapter. He wouldn't know one thing from another. It's not Faulkner. He doesn't know it. No, Jason Harrigan. You could ask him for the Irish pronunciation. The word is Tain. He's a great Irish epic. And Brian at Bookish actually started off his version of the tag of, I think Steve has not read this book, with this. I think he specified the Kinsella translation, but I have read this thing without translation, and I've read it countless times. I have no idea what he's thinking. That would have been his first choice of a book I haven't read. So we're going to pass over that in silence, because he came up with a lot of other interesting things. And out of his, I think he did 8. Out of his 8, just like Mayberry Bookclub, there were only 2 that I have not read. So there are books on all of these tags that I have not read. I have never claimed to have read every book in the world. I think the ultimate genesis of this whole thing comes from the fact that I think in a tag with Deb, she raised the flag and told all of you, oh my God, BookTube, one thing you shouldn't ever do is ask Steve, have you ever read? Don't start a question that way. And I have a bit of a shtick, a bit of an irritated shtick, that I read 150 pages an hour for an average of 8 or 10 hours every day, and I have since long before most of you were born, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to ask, have you ever read On the Road? I think that might have been the ultimate genesis here, but one way or another, there were some books that Brian mentioned, and I wanted to mention them as well, not the Ton. We're going to skip over that. Of course, I have read it many times. But the next one that he did was Through the Wheat by Thomas Boyd. He said that it was an important part of his own reading growing up, and I wholeheartedly second that. It is a brilliant, brilliant historical novel by a guy who lived it. This is most of you are familiar with the pattern of, for instance, Going After Cacciato by Tim O'Brien, where he went to an active theater of war, came back and immortalized it in a novel. A lot of you of a slightly older generation will remember The Naked and the Dead, where Norman Mailer did the exact same thing. Through the Wheat was William Boyd's version, or Thomas Boyd's version of that. He went and served in World War I, then came back and wrote a great book. And he wrote a bunch of all of his books are really, really good. None are quite as good as Through the Wheat. It is a clear masterpiece. And who knows what he would have gone on to write if he hadn't made the mistake of going to Vermont. And the minute he got there, he died of a cerebral hemorrhage. They drop like flies once you get to the 14th state. So I have read that one, and I strongly recommend it. The next one that he recommended was River of Teeth by Sarah Gailey, and I can't believe that he would think that I haven't read this. It's a fantastic pair of novellas set in an alternate America in the 19th century, in which feral hippos are introduced into the Mississippi Delta in an attempt to bring the landscape to heal, and also so that they can be hunted for meat. And things go awry. Things go very, very awry. The hippos start to win. They reproduce like crazy in a great environment with no great predators. And I don't know I don't know how many people on BookTube listening to me right now have ever met a wild hippo or been anywhere near one. Maybe some of you have taken a safari. It's possible that if that is true, then you may have seen them in a distance, snorting and swatting themselves. And maybe one of them made a run for your safari boat. They do routinely do it. They are unbelievably savage animals. Most of them, especially in certain parts of Africa, are much bigger than you think they'll be, and they're incredibly fast. And when one disappears and you think, okay, well, it's been a long time, I think we're safe, they can hold their breath for like years. Seems that way anyway. And they're immensely savage. They're not these big, bovine things. Actually, Africa has very few big, benign bovine things. Virtually anything that you see on the African plain is already in a bad mood. You would be too, if it was 115 degrees in the shade. And hippos attack people all the time, and are responsible for more deaths in Africa than big cats. And these novellas, in the book that Jason mentioned is River of Blood, but I actually read these in a collection called American Hippo. That was terrific, absolutely terrific. So once again, I have read the book, and just like Through the Wheat, I wholeheartedly recommend it. Brian is actually making a great list of books here. So the next one is The Antiquarian by Gustavo Patriau. And I read it. My critical brethren were over the moon about it. I was not over the moon about it. I could see why Brian would like it, and I think that Jason Harrigan would probably like it even more. It's full of bookish incunabula. It's full of the rare book trade and all that kind of stuff. All that kind of stuff that novelists who include that kind of stuff, that world, in their novels, always overestimate how interesting normal people find it. Normal people don't find it interesting at all. Even normal bookish people don't find it interesting at all. So the Antiquarian didn't really do it for me, but I did read it. And then the next one is Modern Baptists by James Wilcox. Now, like everybody else in the world of a certain age, I read the New Yorker article that was 40,000 words of its author saying, nobody reads James Wilcox and everybody should. And before that, I'd read one book, I think, and like everybody else in the entire bookish world, I read that New Yorker article and then went out and read all of James Wilcox. So I have read American Baptist, as is usually the case with articles like that in the Atlantic or Harper's or New Yorker or whatever. As is usually the case, the article was significantly oversold the bill of goods. James Wilcox is at best a C-rate novelist. So in other words, that is not meant purely as an insult. His novels will please, but they will not thrill. They will not raise the hair on your nape of your head or anything like that. I don't know if they did with Brian, but if they did, just keep in mind Satan. So the next book is A Life by Italo Svevo, and I have read A Life. I think it was Pushkin Press that came out with a really nice block paperback of it years and years ago, and I read it then. I have not read it untranslated. In its own defense, I should say that. I've only ever read it in English translation, and it's a labor. It really is. I find this author just laborious just in general. I know that he is praised and loved, but I don't see it. And then the next one is March, which is book one of a graphic novel about Congressman John Lewis. And again, this one's a little confusing for me to be on Brian's list because this thing won all sorts of comic graphic novel awards. It was in all sorts of mainstream book coverage. Of course, I got a copy and I read it. It didn't do much for me. If you're going to be a graphic novel and you're going to present yourself to me in 4 colors, you'd better have somebody from Krypton, and there wasn't anyone in this thing in the whole length of it, so it didn't really do much for me in the same way that, for instance, a nice big fat biography of John Lewis would do. But I did read it. Come now. Then the next one was the next two are the two that I have not read. One was called Gramercy Park by Carole Klein, all about the artist community that was the original impetus for the Gramercy Park neighborhood of Manhattan. Sounds really fascinating. I 10 years ago, I knew someone who actually had a place at Gramercy Park, and he wasn't his, it was in his family, and I have therefore been inside some of the buildings there, and it's a world within a world, even in the upper, the posh upper reaches of Manhattan. So I'd be interested in reading the book. And the same thing with the next one. Same thing also, the two that I haven't read are nonfiction works of history. How's that for letting the side down? The next one is A Spirited Resistance by Gregory Evans Dowd, which is apparently about the raping of the Ohio Territory, and according to Brian, it features Tecumseh, who is a historical figure that he says fascinates him. I didn't know that. You learn all these things, even about Satan. So I haven't read that one either. I want to read both of those now. So that is your answer to this tag that is suddenly creeping around BookTube, wondering what Steve has not read. Of these books, I haven't read those two. And then the last one was The Most Dangerous Book by Kevin Birmingham, which is about James Joyce's Ulysses. It's not a study. It's a study of, it's a biography of a book. It's one of those books, and it's very, very good. I have no patience for James Joyce's Ulysses, not to be confused with Steve Donoghue's Ulysses, the second volume in my trilogy of novels about the Trojan War, which I titled, friends of mine have said, oh, you wrote a book called Ulysses? No, the title of the book is Steve Donoghue's Ulysses, specifically as a dig at James Joyce, because we always hear James Joyce's Ulysses. I have read Birmingham's book about Joyce's book. Just because I hate Joyce's book doesn't mean that I avoid reading about it. That's another thing that came up in in Brian's video, is that he said that he wasn't going to mention people like Cormac McCarthy or William Faulkner because he didn't think that would be fair, because he knows that I hate those authors. And what is the implication there? That because I hate them, I won't read them. That is absolutely not true. That is absolutely not true. It's because I've read everything they've written that I do hate them. And I would think that would be obvious, right? Because on this channel, not that long ago, I did a sentence-by-sentence, paragraph-by-paragraph demolition of Cormac McCarthy's crappy bro-apocalypse novel, The Road. You couldn't do that without reading the thing. I've read it twice now. But I would imagine that I'm going to see a lot of that in comments on variations on this tag. I imagine I'm going to see a lot of what I've gotten my whole life, of people saying, well, you love history, you love biography, you love the classics, so obviously you don't read contemporary fiction. And in my own defense, I will point out what I was pointing out long before there was a BookTube. I read more contemporary fiction than fans of contemporary fiction do. I know currently 3 people whose job it is to review contemporary fiction. I read more contemporary fiction than all 3 of them put together. Just because I don't like it, just because it's all about lighthouse keepers with identical twins, doesn't mean I don't read it. But anyway, that is the Has Steve Donoghue Read It version of the tag from Brian at Bookish. Now that I've seen someone else do this, and Brian tagged other people, I have to start commenting on these things. This is just too funny. So I'm gonna wrap this up for now. I will try to keep up a steady pattern of boring BookTube videos for you, but I will list all these books down below in case you're interested in finding them, because there are quite a few really good recommendations here. And if that becomes, a version of what this tag is doing, recommending off-the-beaten-track books while poking the bear, as one person put it, fine by me. Bring it on. I want to see if anybody can do this tag and get all 8 with me saying no. We shall see. As long as you don't, the rules have to be, there have to be a few rules in place, right? You can't go straight after a book that was printed at your local parish 100 years ago or something like that no one has read. This is Brian's is a good example of books that are out there in the world, that I might have had a chance to read. But either way, bring it on. So I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.